Hello friends, and welcome to a new episode of Reality Check. Our age is dominated by the ephemeral and the transient. Cultural deconstruction runs rampant, and a looming nihilism seems to engulf all meaning and existence itself. Yet the transcendent still manages to break through. Here at Reality Check, we inquire how to conserve the real in a time of deconstruction. At the crossroads of biology, medicine, and ethics lies the fascinating field of bioethics, where life's scientific frontiers meet humanity's deepest moral and ethical questions. Here, new medical advancements seem to challenge traditional ethical frameworks, prompting us to reconsider what it means to live, to die, and even to heal. Bioethics compels us to navigate this terrain, balancing innovation with integrity. That's why it's a great pleasure today to welcome Dr. D Camilo. Dr. D Camilo is an ethicist and a personal consultations director at the National Catholics Bioethics Center, NCBC for short. He manages the NCBC's comprehensive 24/7 ethics consultation service, which is free of charge and available to anyone. He also mentors personal consultations fellows and interns while personally handling and reviewing hundreds of consultations annually. Prolific writer and speaker, Dr. D Camilo applies Catholic moral theology to contemporary issues in science and medicine. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. D Camilo. Hi, John.
Hey, Jan. Thanks. It's a great pleasure to be here with you.
Your bio make you sound like you are very busy and generally seems very tiring. So maybe you can give us a little bit of an introduction of what the life of a bioethicist actually look like from a day-to-day basis.
Well, it sounds like the description is very real then, because it is quite busy. Where I work at the National Catholic Bioethics Center, essentially we spend a lot of time doing education, research, publication, and primarily consultation, as you heard. So we basically field phone calls and emails from people who have questions about should I continue to do dialysis, for example, for an elderly loved one? Should we continue on the ventilator? Is it necessary to provide nutrition and hydration? These end-of-life type scenarios. We also get a number of questions around marital sexuality, contraception, abortion, complications of pregnancy and how to handle those without committing an abortion, those sorts of dynamics where we're in the fine lines where people have a strong sense that, I don't want to do anything that's contrary to the dignity of the human person. I don't want to do anything contrary to my Catholic Christian faith. But what does that actually look like in a real life scenario? This is the free consultation service that we have and that I head up. We also provide consultation, however, for institutions as well. So for Catholic healthcare organizations, for dioceses and bishops. So we have a whole area of the work that we do that's dedicated to this as well, trying to help them, to inform them, to guide them on the latest updates of what the ethical challenges are and how to navigate those from a Catholic Christian standpoint. And so in particular, I'd say our charism, as it were, at the National Catholic Bioethics Center is to make sure we understand and apply Catholic moral teaching. And so we use natural reason as well as the light of revelation through Holy Scripture, through the magisterium of the Catholic Church, and that tradition of the Catholic Church that brings us very rich series of documents and of teachings that we can trace back even centuries to help inform how to respond to these current situations. So it does, and it is quite involving because we're a small organization. We just have several full-time ethicists, but we're covering the entire United States and sometimes even the entire world. We get calls at times and questions from all over the world globally as well.
Very cool. Well, your small team maybe is just in proportionality of the small number of bioethicists that exist just generally in. So what is your personal interest in getting into this field? I feel like this is not a field where somebody gets into to make like lots of money. So how did you and what made you decide to specifically get down that track?
Yeah, great question. And I would say it was definitely the collision of two main factors. One was my growing intellectual life as an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania here in the United States, and also the growing depth of my faith at that time. So I was confronted with a lot of questions on an intellectual level. I did not have the tools that I felt I needed to understand and respond to those just rationally. So I was looking for more, trying to understand more. And on the other hand, I was also trying to go deeper into my faith and discovering the intellectual tradition there, growing in a life closer to our Lord and saying, well, now how does all this reconcile? And, I'm a science major. So as an undergrad, I was a pre-med. I was studying the biological basis of behavior, which is essentially a cross between psychology and neuroscience. And so, this scientific interest I always had, this sort of, medical interest I always had, was now combining with this interest in my faith. And so I discovered this discipline of bioethics, basically. And actually, a big part of that was the fact of the National Catholic Bioethics Center at that time was actually in Philadelphia, not far from my university. And so I discovered this organization. I discovered this discipline. And I found that there was, this was a way to go deeper. But as far as the actual questions I was posing, why would I take a deep dive into bioethics in particular? I mean, really two major questions that I think a lot of people grapple with. One is the question of free will, and are we really free? And the other is the question of human sexuality and what is good and right human action in the realm of human sexuality. And those were two issues that tie into the big number one point, which is love. What is love? And I was really struggling with this as a neuroscience undergrad, basically, with a lot of my classes being scientism and reducing everything to just the material world and our instincts. And, you're all determined by evolution to do certain things. And so I was posing this question to myself, like, well, so does love really even exist? Is it a real thing? Talking about reality check here, right? Like, is love even a real thing? And what does that look like? And so both free will and sexuality were, intertwined with this. Like, well, what is love? Well, love, if there's no real freedom, I just remember this popping into my head one day as I'm like thinking about all this from the neuroscience standpoint. If we're actually just determined by our environments, then there's no such thing as free will. And if there's no such thing as free will, then love is actually a meaningless concept. We're just following instincts. And so, you can see how that, it all just took me on a deeper dive. And then this discipline presented itself of bioethics. And I was like, hey, wow, this connects everything. This connects the dots of, my interest in the biological sciences and medicine with the question of what are good and right actions and how does love ultimately infuse and undergird all of this, which then also ties us to the Catholic piece, right? The Catholic Christian piece of, well, again, what is love? Is love a real thing? And who is love? So that's how I got into bioethics.
That's amazing. That's quite a story. And what's really particularly fascinating to me is that it's remarkable how many people, I would say, are maybe intuitively materialists and live a materialistic worldview, but they never really reflect it. So they don't get prompted either, because the culture doesn't really care. And love is love, and love is whatever you want it to be fundamentally. But I feel it's really powerful that you took that time to reflect upon this and to say, wait a second, if we are materially determined, and I think what you mean by that is if we're determined by, the pheromones, the brain function, and all of what that means for how to get the human body going, if that's really all there is, then, well, what we mean when we talk about poetic love, so a love that is romantic, a love that is, even in the Christian way, sacrificial, it doesn't make any sense because it doesn't fit together. If we are made, so to speak, and if we cannot escape that material, let's say, shell, right, then there's nothing more. And I feel it's really amazing, because when you, in conversation, when you do press people, they do come to the most absurd conclusions. I had a conversation here with a younger fellow, and we talked about this, and he said, well, obviously there's no free will. He said this over lunch, and I kind of like looked at my piece of chicken. I was like, well, hold on here. I don't think that this is so obvious. I think actually there is free will. And so I started querying him, and I started asking him, so like, what, I mean, like, do you want children, right? And he's like, yeah, because that's my biological predetermination. It's like, well, it's not predetermined that you're going to care for the child, right? Are you going to let it starve? And he said, no, because I'm biologically programmed to feed the child.
Oh my goodness,
like, well,
yes.
good luck explaining that to your child, once he's 10, and that's the only reason why you actually care for the child. So, but it's amazing how widespread that actually is. Is that your experience as well?
Yes, Totally. Absolutely. Yeah. And it was, again, my experience, even among many of the people I was studying with, right? Fellow undergraduates studying neuroscience, with this emphasis, so much is like, we're so smart. We can understand all this stuff, and we all want to understand human action and human behavior. And there's a good in that. But it was just like this overall sense that, but wait a minute, there's a huge piece of this missing. Like, it's not just about, well, what are some factors that contribute to human behaviors that we can observe empirically or scientifically, which are completely valid, but also this question of, well, how should we behave? And are we really free to determine that? So again, you can see now how that tied into the ethics in particular, and why I became interested in ethics, because I also realized the connection once you start talking about free will, like, again, that's a necessary precondition for any assessment about whether an action is good or bad. Is this right or wrong? And that's what ethics is about, right? So bioethics is just the application of, it's the study of human action that is applied to the area, the discipline of life, bio, right? So we're talking about whether human actions are right or wrong, good or evil, as they pertain to decisions around life. And that can be human life. Bioethics in the broadest sense can be human life. It can also be questions about the environment and how we interact with our environment, and all these sorts of issues. It can also be healthcare, specifically biomedical research. So there's just the whole sphere of life, basically. Like, let's apply this to life. But that's the point. Like, what you're getting at here is, so if there's nothing more to our actions than just pre-programming, materialistic pre-programming, then all this is in vain. Or why are we even sitting here talking about it? Okay, well, I'm just pre-programmed, so let's just follow whatever my programming tells me to do. And when I do something, I deserve no merit. I certainly deserve no blame either. So hey, look, if you think I did something bad, that's just your feelings reacting to something that I did, which you're pre-programmed and I'm pre-programmed to do. And there's actually no right or wrong. It's just the way it is. And so it's like, well, if you do that, now we're stuck, because there's really no path to what we could call virtue. Like, what does it mean to be a truly good and virtuous person? There's no path to holiness. What does holiness even mean anymore? It's all just everybody is doing whatever they're pre-programmed to do. There's no real merit or blame for anyone for anything. And that, then ultimately then it melts into the total relativism we see in the culture, right? This is like, okay, so once everything's material, then also everything's relative, because there's actually no objective that we're supposed to be working toward, which we're actually free to pursue. And to say, wow, that person did a great job moving in that direction. It might have been really tough to overcome some of those passions, instincts, etc., and to build good habits based on reason. That's all gone. No, because it's just you're pre-programmed. So
it's really remarkable how bioethics, and again, I'm not a bioethicist, but I can see it from the outside, that part of the fragmentation of academia kind of materializes in every field being very specialized at this point, but focusing on basically just a given number and given set of problems. But then there is very little cross insemination, I guess, and cross kind of interdisciplinary work. And I feel that especially in the field of ethics and biology, the practical life, our quotidian life, actually has so many applications, so many questions arise, as you already mentioned, in the beginning of life issues, the end of life issues, and also just life issues, that having a biological input, but at the same time having the ethical framework, is just so vital. And again, I say this as a philosopher. It's like, well, just by studying, what, I don't know, Aquinas or Hegel or Descartes or Kant said about life and the meaning of life, doesn't mean that I actually have the answers to, as you said, the question of, well, should we continue with the dialysis of my grandmother? Actually was a question. It's funny that you bring that up.
Oh, wow.
There was a question, and I went back. I talked to a friend who, unfortunately not to you, but I should have, but I talked to a friend who was very well versed, and he said, well, look at the life functions, look at this or that, and then you make a decision. And it was really pertinent. And this is, I think, what stresses the significance of the work of the bioethicist, especially the work that you're doing, is doctors oftentimes now, they leave the decision to you. The doctor that was in charge regarding the dialysis question, our gut feeling told us not to do it. My mother, it was her mother and me. And the doctor said, I leave it up to you. And we asked her for counsel,
Right.
and she basically refused to give us counsel, which is really amazing when you think about it. But she said, well, she thinks from a liability standpoint, right? And now, especially in the United States, obviously the whole kind
Yes.
of ambulance chaser framework makes that worse. So anyways, but that also goes to show that bioethics as this, I don't know, interdisciplinary approach, I think is
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. That's right. And which is one of the things that I always have to tell people. Like, so when people do come to us and they seek our consultation advice, the first thing is, hey, I'm here to help you form your conscience. You have to make a decision. But now what I'm going to do is effectively serve as a sort of translator for you. I'm going to give you the principled framework, which is sort of the substance of what the ethicist does, right? Like
Yeah.
here are principles. Here is, sort of philosophically, this is the way you think through these issues. I'm going to give you a number of considerations and factors that you need to take into account. I'm going to give you some Catholic Christian teachings on these things, from the Catechism or from other scriptural references or from magisterial documents, etc. Because you need to know these things to make your moral decision here, your ethical decision. I'm also going to try to bring to you some resources that are medical, potentially legal, potentially in other areas, but big caveat, disclaimer, I'm not a medical doctor. Like,
Yeah.
I'm an ethicist, not a medical doctor.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to bring you, as much as I can reasonably offer. I'm going to offer you information I'm aware of. I'm going to give you some other resources. But even at the end of the day, I'm going to say to you, yes, but you should also check with, a medical expert if you need, a legal expert if you need, people who do have this expertise in other areas. But I'm serving as a facilitator, which is kind of what you were getting at too, in a sense. But I'm saying, like, here are the different pieces. You need to know what the different pieces are and how they factor into this puzzle here. And then you're going to make, in the end, an assessment of what the right path forward is. But the biggest thing I need to give you from my expertise is, again, what are the moral or ethical principles? Things like the principle of double effect, or we talk about totality and integrity. There's a whole series of these principles that have been developed over centuries of reflection within Catholic Christian teaching, but also within the secular world. These same kind of basic ideas that are ways of thinking and weighing the different factors. So if I say, no, I'm going to not continue dialysis, is it because I want to kill my mother, if she's the one who's on the dialysis, or is it because the dialysis has become excessively burdensome with respect to a certain amount of benefit, and even though we foresee she's going to die as a result, that's clearly not the intention? And so again, this is what I'm here to help you with. Like, you need here now. Actually, that is a different thing. One thing is to say, let's put her out of her misery and stop the dialysis because she just needs to die. Another thing is to say, wow, this dialysis is a really burdensome process. She's been doing it for a while. It's getting worse. It requires more visits to a dialysis center or whatever that is. And so it's certainly legitimate and within reason and within respect for human life to say at a certain point, this is just too much to ask of this person, or this person is burdened too much by this process, by this intervention. So they can say no to the intervention, but that's not saying no to life itself. And actually this happens a number of times with things like ventilators, for example. We see in our experience where you'll say, well, we could turn off the ventilator. The person's, basically dependent on that ventilator to continue breathing. And in most of these cases, the doctors are going to tell you, look, in this situation, you turn off that ventilator, this patient's going to die, and it's going to be relatively quick. And okay, well, we turn it off because it's become burdensome, not because we want to kill the patient. And then in some of these cases, the patient actually unexpectedly continues to improve and regains breathing function. And the family's happy, right? Because the decision was made not because we need to kill this person. The decision was made because the vent is too burdensome. So if the person does improve, great, all the better. So you can see the difference in how this plays out at the intention level of the individual and what the act is directed to. And so there's, again, so there's our expertise as ethicists trying to tell you, here's the principle, here you think through this. What is, identifying what the actual object of your act is, the intention, the circumstance, and so forth. And then, you, however, need to pull together the pieces to say, yes, this is disproportionate and burdensome, or no, it's not, for example, in the context of end-of-life treatment. So, yeah.
A very fine line indeed, though, right? To distinguish these two
there absolutely are
mentalities and
correct.
So
correct.
one of the things that sparked my interest, reading recent news, and there's been quite the coverage, which reached all the way to over the pond to Oxford and other places, is you penned a document on and concerning brain death. Now there's a lot of details to consider,
Yeah.
in the in the discussion in general, but then also what this paper is actually aimed to do. But I feel like I should give a brief, just kind of framework, and you correct me. You correct me if I get this wrong. But I feel that the recent debates on brain death have really focused on the criteria that is used to declare brain death. And so traditionally, from what I understand, brain death is declared when there's an irreversible cessation of all brain functions determined through specific clinical tests. But there is an ongoing controversy regarding the adequacy and the consistency of these kind of criteria. So you penned a document regarding this problem, or a related problem, and the related problem is obviously, and this is what hopefully most people are aware of, is the problem of organ donation, right? Because oftentimes brain death is the prerequisite, or rather is the diagnosis, which is followed by potential organ donation, right? And it is all done in the name of charity, in the name of love, right? In the name of service to the other, that, well, in the sense that, well, if my body doesn't function, I'm not even conscious anymore, at least my biological parts, my organs, my organic parts can help somebody else, right? Who is maybe completely healthy, safe, the kidneys are not working, or there's a problem with the heart, or there is, I don't know. So whatever it may be. So these two kind of great topics you tackled in this paper, and I would just like you to correct me if I set the stage wrong here, but then also tell us a little bit about that paper, maybe the genesis of that paper, and why you got particularly interested in this topic.
Sure. So let me start by confirming what you're saying in terms of the connection of, just brain death in general and organ transplantation, and the connection between the two, being obviously a very important and serious matter of concern. In other words, there's this question of, what does it mean to die as a human person? And brain death is the idea that when the brain is dead, the human person is dead. Okay. Mm-hmm. Organ transplantation, as we know it today, particularly vital organ transplantation, and there are a lot of distinctions here to be careful about. I'm not going to be able to cover all of them, but let's just say this: vital organ transplantation, meaning things like the heart, or both lungs, or both kidneys, something that you can't survive without. And if you were to remove it, it's going to kill you, basically, right? These are what we could call vital organs for the purpose of this discussion. Vital organ removals have really only been happening since brain death was proposed as a concept in the late 1960s. Okay, and ultimately implemented and accepted over time, in actual practice. Although I should mention right from the get-go that there has been a strong principled debate about whether the very idea that brain death equates to death of the human person is even valid. Right. And that's a philosophical, anthropological question specifically, like, who is a human person? What does it mean to be a human person? What's the relationship between body and soul? And does the death of a single organ, like the brain, mean that the whole human person as such has ceased to exist as an organism and as a body-soul unity? Okay. So that question, that principal debate existed since the start, and it has continued, and it has never ended. And there are still very strong debates around whether, in principle, brain death is even valid. But in practice, it quickly was taken up and implemented as a valid concept. And so since that happened, it has facilitated, it made possible things like a heart transplant. Because under the traditional criteria, well, you declare somebody dead when the heart stops beating, right? You wait a certain amount of time. You'd look for other signs like, liver mortis, algor mortis, rigor mortis, all of these, the mortises, right? The traditional signs of death, of actual destruction, decay, or the early stages of those about to happen, and ultimately decomposition and organic destruction. But there was no rush, certainly, right, to try to declare somebody dead at an earlier time. That need to declare somebody dead also in large part was due to the advent of ventilators, all right, ventilators in the 1950s, so right before the 1960s declaration. And that made it possible to say, wait a minute, now this person who, is basically totally unconscious, can't interact with their environment, but they're on a ventilator that's keeping the lungs filling with air, okay, which means that the heart can still keep pumping because it's getting oxygenation, and it can put oxygenated blood to the rest of the body, etc. But then there came this issue of, well, now these people are on these ventilators for a long time and they appear to be dead because they're not interacting anymore. But again, to connect to the organ transplantation, but what this means is, hey, here's a way that if these people are actually dead, right, if they just appear to be alive, but the vent is just making them appear to be alive, but they're actually corpses, then we could actually take their hearts and we could take their lungs, which are organs that can survive only very short times without oxygenated blood. If we were doing these after declarations of cardiac death, you're never going to get the heart because it's going to suffer so much injury from lack of oxygenated blood after 15, 20 minutes of being dead, or especially if you're waiting for some of those longer term signs, it's way too late. You can't get those organs. So anyway, I want to emphasize the historical connection and how this comes about. There's a debate about death itself, what it means to die, and how that filters right into the organ transplantation question. Now let me skip to what you asked about this document. Why this document? Why now? What's going on? Okay, so there's this overall debate at the level of principle that's been ongoing. There have been a number within the Catholic Church in particular of discussions of this issue that have indicated that the Church has seemed to indicate that brain death can be consistent with a Catholic Christian anthropology. That has not been definitively resolved by the magisterium, but there have been some, like the Pontifical Academy for Sciences and working groups of this sort, a statement that John Paul II made in the year 2000, which suggested the anthropological consistency of brain death with a Catholic Christian anthropology. But none of this certainly has been authoritative, definitive magisterial teaching. Okay, but it has been moving in the direction of, yeah, the concept is okay. What have we done? This document, so is co-authored by Dr. Joseph Ebley, Dr. Pete Colosi, and myself. And the three of us basically said, hey, at this point in time, given everything that we've been seeing, given recent developments in the medical literature or evidence that's coming out in different studies, there seems to be strong indication that, number one, the concept of whole brain death, that the whole brain has irreversibly stopped functioning, is actually not being done in practice. In other words, you do surveys of neurologists and others who do declarations of brain death, and you see that they're not consistently doing it. You go to one hospital, you go to one state, and the actual criteria they're using are not even the same or consistent. All right. And next thing you see is, okay, now we have these guidelines that were put out by the American Academy of Neurology here in the United States. They were put out first in 95, updated 2010, and just recently in 2023. Now, if you follow those guidelines rigorously, though, they allow for some parts of the brain to continue functioning. In particular, something called the hypothalamus, which is a neuroendocrine structure that basically deals with hormones and chemical signals, saltwater balance, and a number of other what we could call homeostasis aspects. It's a coordinating center of the brain, which continues to function even if you're following those guidelines, is the point here. So, all right, so point number one, in practice, people aren't actually consistently following any set standard, although a very basic set of, let's say, 3 broad criteria are supposed to be followed, which is that there's an irreversible coma, that there is apnea, so the person's not spontaneously breathing on their own, and there's a lack of brainstem reflexes. Those are the 3 kind of basic clinical criteria for brain death, or what's called whole brain death anyway, across the board. But again, sometimes based on surveys, some people aren't even doing the apnea test, they're not doing it correctly, and so on and so forth. So you have inconsistency. So all of this to say, we wanted to point out to everybody, look, there's an ongoing principled debate about whether brain death is valid at all as a concept. That is not about to be resolved anytime soon. But it's very clear that in practice, what is happening is not, the way that people are being declared brain dead is not even what whole brain death is supposed to be. either in ethics or under the law, because from an ethical standpoint, those who support whole brain death will say, yeah, it's supposed to be irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain. That was the language John Paul II used when he once suggested that it could be consistent with Catholic anthropology. And it's also the language that's found in the Uniform Declaration of Death Act here in the United States, which dates back to the early 1980s. So if you're going to declare somebody dead, brain dead, it has to be, according to the language here, irreversible cessation of all function of the entire brain. And so if you've got this one part of the brain in particular, at least like the hypothalamus, still functioning in something like 50 to 84% of cases, just based on a survey of the medical literature, that's a big problem. Like 50%, that's half of donors, who are, I should say, half of people declared brain dead. But then we look to donation, and about 70% of organ donors who have their organs harvested after a declaration of death, 70% of them are declared dead using brain death criteria, which is a long way of saying they may not actually be dead, right? 50 to 84% of those declared brain dead actually still have brain function of the hypothalamus at least, and maybe even other parts of the brain. And so that's not consistent even with the concept of whole brain death, is our point. And that's why we put this document together, as we said, okay, look, 2023, we got a new set of guidelines from the American Academy of Neurology. There was an effort to change the Uniform Determination of Death Act here in the United States to try to change it so that that definition I just mentioned about irreversible cessation of all function of the entire brain would actually be changed to just permanent cessation, among other things. And actually, they wanted to change the definition to reflect exactly what the American Academy of Neurology guidelines require. So they wanted to change the definition, the principal definition, to match the actual clinical practice. But the actual clinical practice here is a problem because it doesn't even attempt to test for the cessation of function of all the brain or irreversibly.
Okay.
Sorry,
okay,
that was a lot.
No, that's quite good. Again, it shows certainly how well you have dealt with the minute elements of this problem field. Okay, so okay, let me get this straight. Just to sum up, basically, the criteria that to determine brain death is not universally applied. It's in itself questionable. It's not universally applied. Many of the patients that have been declared fully brain dead have actually not been tested or tested not exactly, and so those now become the organ donors. Okay,
right.
So now, and that obviously poses a problem. So I mean, to say this a little bit more brutishly, you could say that they're killed for the organs to be taken out.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. So now those are my words. But so what does the document address specifically? If you say that it doesn't address the general debate, so what's the novelty here, and does it actually help? Well, this is specifically penned for Catholics, right? So does it help the Catholics to discern what to do in a specific situation, or?
Yes, great question. Yeah. So absolutely. What it does is it says, in light of all this, right, which I just laid out, right? Like we have serious practical problems with whether brain death is even doing what it claims to do, right? Whether the diagnosis and the criteria are doing what they claim to do, which is determining cessation of function of all function of the entire brain. Yeah. Clearly, that's not happening. And since that's the only thing that the church has suggested might be legitimate, that whole brain understanding of irreversible cessation. Okay, that's not happening. And the church has made clear, and respect for the human person in general would require, from just a reason standpoint, that people actually be dead before you take their organs out. And now we're saying it's clear we don't have certainty that these people who are being declared brain dead are actually dead. Certainly you, as the average Catholic out there, who may know nothing about all this debate that I just mentioned, or this whole history, right? Like certainly you, the average person, don't know about all this. And while there may be some really smart people continuing to debate philosophically whether brain death is valid as a concept and whether it does or doesn't comport with Catholic Christian anthropology, to you, the person on the ground, you need to understand that the people being declared brain dead are not actually even whole brain dead the way in the way that these people are debating about, like the people who say it can be okay. So it's very clear that in practice, whatever you think about the principle debate, in practice, it's clear that people may well be alive, and in a large percentage of cases, evenly may well be alive when their organs are removed, which means that the organ donation may in fact be killing a large number of people. And this is only, and the data that we cite is only with respect to one function of the brain, which is the hypothalamic function that I mentioned, right? But there are a number of other questions around it too, and other areas of the brain that may be functioning that aren't being tested for or not tested adequately and so forth. So we took this one case to just say how abundantly clear it is that the whole brain is not dead. So even if you think that the whole brain being dead means that the whole person is dead, it's still not enough. And so in practice, what we say is, and there's where it comes in, well, what does this mean and how is it helping? Well, it's helping people to understand when they need to make a decision, should I be an organ donor?
Yeah.
Probably not, right? I would advise against it because you have no way of knowing, well, which facility are you going to be in? Which doctor is going to make your determination of death? Is it one of the rare Catholic doctors who believes that whole brain death is valid and who's going to use a whole set of additional rigorous criteria that go beyond what the American Academy of Neurology requires, which is already sort of the most rigorous standard out there, right? So that would be an extremely exceptional case. Now, are you going to say something like, hey, well, let me just write an advance directive in which I'll specify all of the criteria that I think should be followed for someone to declare me brain dead? Well, does the average person have the understanding to be able to do something like that with the level of certainty that anyone's even going to actually listen to it or apply it in practice? And I couldn't even tell you right now which exact criteria would establish certainty of whole brain death. There are some docs I know who are great Catholic docs who are making some proposals out there that they think, hey, these are the criteria we think should be required in order to establish whole brain death. And I say, great, I'm happy to look at and consider those too from an ethics standpoint. But there are other docs out there saying, no, you don't need that. And actually, we think these other criteria would be needed. So there's still a medical debate about, well, what is even the best way to improve the criteria to ensure whole brain death? And that's just within, again, small Catholic circles, right? You alluded to our small bioethics group before, right? This is a tiny sliver of the world. And your audience here is not necessarily all Catholic. I mean, there are a lot of Christians and others who have no religious affiliation even. Everybody needs to understand that this kind of tiny debate happening in Catholic circles is one thing. And that's our main audience we're trying to speak to in this particular document, because we're trying to just get people to understand and reason and get some unity around this. But in the broader secular world, it's been quite a while that people have admitted that brain death is a legal fiction. That is a convenient fiction that enables us to harvest organs. And there have been a number of just secular ethicists out there, medical doctors and others as well, who've all been saying, yeah, no, this is a fiction. We all know that brain death doesn't actually mean that the human being is dead. But it's a great way for us to be allowed to get these really important organs that are saving lives, And so if that's being publicly admitted by, prominent authors in prominent journals in the medical and ethical fields, we continue to have these debates, of the sort of minutia of whether this fits with Catholic anthropology. But the broader world is essentially already admitting for some time that this just doesn't fly. It doesn't actually respect the organismic reality of death of a human being. But it's a way to get organs. So anyway, our help that we want to offer with this document is in any case to say, look, we should all be able to agree, given the practical problems with this, regardless of what you think about in principle, it's wise for people to not be organ donors because you very likely may be alive when they cut your heart out or remove your lungs, et cetera. Or, taking it a step further, then we think anyone and everyone should have the right to conscientiously object to the use of brain death criteria. Again, simply on these grounds that, look, there's significant disagreement, both in principle and in practice, about whether what's happening is actually ensuring people are dead. So at a minimum, again, regardless of where you stand on the principle, we should all be able to agree that in practice, people need to have a right to say no. I don't want you to use brain death criteria in my case. I don't want you to use, I as a healthcare professional don't want to use the brain death criteria myself because I don't think they're adequate as a healthcare professional. Or an institution, a Catholic hospital. I should have a right to say no to requiring the use of brain death criteria in organ transplantation practices, given all these problems.
Very good. I think there's a political dimension to all of this. I want to put that off to the side, not to be forgotten, to be addressed just in a slight bit. But I think what needs to be addressed, though, and what I would assume is the strongest case against what you're saying, is by saying, okay, but we're talking about somebody that maybe after an accident, right, is in a coma, so has the organs are intact or largely intact. There's no consciousness, right? There is not really the situation that you can envision as a doctor from a medical perspective where the consciousness returns. So that person will basically just languish as a vegetable, vegetate for years, potentially decades. But now there is this child who was in an accident, who could be saved by a organ transplant. So isn't the greater good here to actually transplant the organ based on the brain death criteria? I'm not saying this is my opinion. I'm saying this is what I feel would be the strongest charge against what you're saying. So how would you tackle that?
Yeah, so there are two things here. Number one is that argument can be made and has been made by those who admit the legal fiction of brain death, who simply say, well, we don't need the patient to actually be dead. Like brain death, why do we even need to say that they're dead? Let's just allow living organ donation, right? Like just allow people, as long as they consent, then we should be able to remove the organs, even if they're not actually dead yet, and give it to another person. And so that's how they'll say, I mean, like, why are we stuck with this so-called dead donor rule, which requires that actually you have to be dead first? And that's one solution that's certainly proposed on the secular side of all this, is to just allow basically an autonomy-based self-gift where I say, I just want to do this if I'm severely injured. Now, again, that, however, admits that the person's not actually dead. On the other hand, okay, we say, well, wait a minute. So why don't, but brain death, we need brain death for this. That also avoids, so if we do accept the dead donor rule, right? So if we do accept the dead donor rule, that somebody actually has to be dead first, which is the logic under which most people, when they agree to be an organ donor, they have that in mind. Like, oh, I'm going to be dead. I don't need my body anymore. Like, why not help somebody else? I'd like to be generous. And if I don't need it, give it to them. I'm dead. What do I care? Which is kind of sad in itself, but that's like the logic of not caring. But anyway, but most people assume and understand when they agree. In the US, in most places, you have to actually sign up and consent to it. Actually, in Europe, in a lot of places and elsewhere, there's presumed consent, which in some, I don't know every state's laws, okay, but I do know there are some where there are presumed consent. So you actually have to opt out if you don't want to be
the UK, Austria, other places as well. I think in Germany they just recently changed it to that as well. So you consciously have to opt out, and many people don't even know that that's the case, legally speaking.
Correct. And again, the presumption is, well, why wouldn't anybody want to do it if they're dead? Right. So there's kind of this underlying assumption in all of these practices and policies that have been put into place, even legally, that all operate on the basic assumption that you're dead. And that's how the presumed consent gains strength, because it says, well, if you're already dead anyway, then we can just presume you want to donate your organs. Okay, so it comes back to this fundamental problem, though, of, well, but are you actually dead? And if you're not, is it ethically right to take your organs, which is going to kill you, in order to help somebody else? So to get to your key, objection that many would raise, right, is like, well, clearly this is going to be a greater good, because this person at best is going to just continue to vegetate, as it were. Of course, they're still a living human person with full dignity of a human person. But we are able to save somebody else by it. And, we can never deliberately take the life of one in order to save one other, or even to save multiple others, right? This comes back to the fundamentals of ethics, that the ends don't justify the means. And so even if we could save 10 people, which is actually something that you will hear organ donation proponents say, especially with brain death, you can get multiple organs. Like for each one organ donor, brain dead organ donor, you can get a whole lot of organs. You can get heart, you can get lungs, you can get kidneys, you can get parts of intestine, you can get liver, right? So you just with one person maybe saved 10, right, who needed an organ. So that's a very strong, obviously, also visceral kind of argument that people are like, well, we want to save lives, and that's totally good. That is a noble intention. You know, the church recognizes the nobility of that intention and wanting to save lives, and certainly any ethicist does as well. But it comes back to that the ends don't justify the means. You cannot take the life of somebody who's still living, actually do a killing act in order to save others.
And this is what's really interesting, because you talked about the autonomous-based reasoning for organ donation. What's really interesting, and this has happened in many other instances on the political sphere, but I feel it mostly on the medical, because that's really where it comes down to, right, to our individual life, is that the autonomy is used as an argument, but ultimately, especially legally speaking, the autonomy is removed. Because as you already state that assumes that your organ donor does not give you autonomy to decide. And it does not, while it may be like a pious ideal that the autonomy is actually granted to the individual, it slowly but surely moves away from that autonomy and puts the autonomy in the hands, and in the decision-making ultimately in the hands of somebody else. And I feel that's what's constantly happening in many of the bioethical question, where what was once kind of like the carrot, or the sugar cube, at the as bait, right? That tries to attract. The autonomy is a big argument, and especially in kind of our individualism or individualistic modernity. But then it is gradually removed, but the concessions have already been made. So now, and again, it's just a matter of graduality, and then you kind of shift, and I mean, we're not talking about, and we haven't talked about, and presumably don't have time to talk about the whole problem with health insurance, right? This is what I see happening in Germany, especially in the more socialized systems, where the health insurance comes in and says, guys, there's a financial dimension to this on both sides. There's a gain to be made, but there's also loss that we're not willing to pay for.
Right.
So, I mean, I can just imagine, I mean, maybe I'm a little bit too dystopian here, but I can imagine a health insurance saying, well, if you're not willing to be an organ donor, then you clearly don't value life, especially not of other people. Right? You're a bad person. What does that mean in our policy, right? Because you clearly demonstrate that you are egotistical and you just want to be, I don't know what word they will make up. Right. You want to be a possessivist of your organs, right?
Yes.
So I feel like this is a slippery slope, and I feel like that's what you're addressing. Now, what I find really beautiful about your document is that, and this is a very good, really good move from what I can tell, is that while it, let's say, brackets the discussion of the viability of the concept of brain death, it actually gives a practical vademecum. It serves as a practical guide, which I feel is so important, because there's one side in any debate where the academia is hopefully, ideally, right, the old universitas is working together to find the truth, but that takes time. But people have to make decisions every day. Right. So what happens in the meantime? And I feel like that's the market gap that you're addressing with this. Do I get this right?
Yes, that's precisely right. Yes, you put it very well. Thank you, because that's exactly what it is. It's trying to say, look, we're not, the discussion needs to continue, and we have a number. So, by the way, I don't even know if I mentioned the title of the document is called Catholics United on Brain Death and Organ Donation, a call to action. So it is, practical action focused, with this sense that, basically right now it's clear that we don't have moral certainty that people who are declared brain dead are actually dead. There's no reasonable expectation that any time in the near future they're going to improve the guidelines in such a way that they actually would establish whole brain death. And therefore, we basically say, this means that we should stop using the current brain death criteria. We should improve them. If you're thinking about organ donation, you should not be an organ donor right now, given the current criteria as they exist. The debates about how to improve them need to continue. So we don't propose specific criteria for what would be the best brain death criteria, or whether any brain death criteria could be sufficient, because then that gets back also to the principal question of, is brain death even sufficient as a concept? So we don't do any of that. We say those discussions need to keep happening, though. That's our final action recommendation, is actually that, like, hey, there's a lot going on here, and we only addressed brain death, but there's actually a whole question of donation after cardiac death, which is the other 30% of those who donate organs after being declared dead, are declared dead using what are called circulatory criteria, and that has a set of problems of its own too that we don't even get into. What's that?
That's the classical criteria, right? The cardiac.
Yes, but there are questions around, for example, the timing. So like you say somebody is dead when their heart stops beating, or circulation stops. Okay, heart stops, circulation stops, you declare them dead. But then there's a question of, okay, well, now how long do you wait to actually declare them dead? Because obviously when somebody's heart just stops, well, you don't have any guarantee they're actually dead yet, because you could resuscitate them. And some people actually spontaneously revive after several minutes of cessation of circulation. And so how long do we wait? And so I don't want to go into that right now, but let's just say that there are some serious questions there as well around, hey, if we're only waiting 2 to 5 minutes after your heart stops beating, is that sufficient to mean that you're really dead, right? Talking about real again versus just conveniently sufficiently dead for us to say that you're dead and mark the certificate dead and now go in and take your heart out before it's too seriously damaged from lack of oxygenation. So there's a whole nother area there that we call for discussion around, is my point, right? This is what I was getting at, that there's all sorts of other ethical questions that are deeply wrapped up with this organ transplantation issue, and how people are determined to be dead, that we're calling for further discussion on as our last action item. But in the meantime, as you said, like, in the meantime, here's the status. Like, it's sufficient for you to know that 70% of people in the US declared dead to have their organs removed are declared dead using brain death criteria. And of those, at least 50 to 84% may still be alive. And so that's using only hypothalamic function. So you've got every reason to think you're probably going to be alive, or when they remove your organs. And so the removal act is going to be a killing act. So for right now, we suggest that you do not be organ donors until we get some clarity and improvement. Maybe 5-10 years from now, maybe they're going to have a lot of these more robust discussions. Maybe we're going to finally resolve these questions around brain death, and maybe we're going to have some really robust new criteria that are put into place, and then we begin to implement them. That's a lot of ifs, but it could happen, and maybe then there's going to be sufficient certainty some point down the road to say, okay, now we can say you'll really be dead. And so, we could say to people at that time, okay, things have improved and we've got good reason to think that you're actually going to be dead now. But that's just not where we
are. Who do you feel you're up against in writing this and in defending this? Like, do you feel that there's a lobby or some kind of political move towards normalizing organ transplantation in general? What do you where do you stand?
Good question. That's a very good question. Our focus with this document was, as I said, kind of very focused to the Catholic issues of trying to, because Catholics are spending a lot of time fighting amongst themselves at the upper levels of these debates around whether brain death is valid at all and whether the criteria are sufficient. We're trying to say, look, can we all just agree, regardless of what you think in principle, that what's happening in practice is not sufficient? And the hope was that, if we could get some unity around that, then hopefully we could start to use that unity around the practical problems to fight the bigger interests that you're talking about, because there definitely are bigger interests in the secular world. Organ transplantation industry obviously has all sorts of perverse incentives to do more and more of the organ donation and to push the boundaries of what is or isn't alive. Now, I don't mean to say here that anyone who's involved with organ transplantation is somehow ill-intentioned or anything of that sort. There's some wonderful people involved in these practices who, I would say maybe on certain levels are misguided or misunderstanding whether people are actually dead in some of these cases. But I think my point is that there are definitely financial incentives, industry incentives for organ transplantations. And that is a problem. That's what we call a conflict of interest, that we're talking about something that's supposed to be, again, at least in Catholic teaching, the whole notion that it could be acceptable to donate organs is built on the idea that this is a self-gift, a completely free gift of self, disinterested, sacrificial, I want to help somebody else. Now, if you if you tie that in though with financial incentives for the industry that's doing this, and they go around promoting and marketing it, and the way they're doing that is actually by ignoring, bypassing, or skipping over a lot of the information around these questions and concerns about whether people are actually dead. Um, then again, you've created an ethical problem where people are taking what is a good and noble intention. Let me help other people. Let me sacrifice myself. I'm going to be dead anyway, so let me help others. All good things. And now your marketing message as an organ transplantation is going to highlight just that, but it's not going to say, hey, do you know what's involved with organ transplantation? Let us tell you about that. Let us give you proper informed consent so you can see what, how this works. Like even the basics. I'm not saying you have to give them the whole, in-depth debate, but just the basics of, do you know what it looks like when somebody is donating their heart? Because I've talked to lots of doctors and nurses who are like, you're in that operating room, anesthesiologists, nurses, et cetera. This person looks no different from the person in the bed next to them who was just severely neurologically damaged and unconscious. They look no different because the heart's beating, flesh is supple. Again, in a lot of these cases, hypothalamus is maybe even still functioning. They appear to be just a person who is unresponsive, who their whole body does not look like what you typically think of when you think of a corpse, right?
Yeah.
But the whole idea is, no, this is a corpse. But we need to give anesthesia to this corpse to make sure that there are no reactions to pain. And we need to, goodness, I read a ghastly article recently of someone who is involved with these organ transplants, who's very much in favor of them still, basically saying how it was like, I feel like this person's really still present. And I'm trying to thank this person who's giving this organ and what a great sacrifice they're making. And I want to make this as peaceful and comfortable as an experience as possible for this person who's giving their organ. I'm like, there's kind of a cognitive disconnect here. Like you're really talking about this as if the person, body and soul, is still present to you, and you're all of these kind of emotional considerations along those lines. But yet we're all supposed to believe and accept that this is a corpse at the same time. So this is there's some really serious issues there of like, well, does the person, when they sign up for the driver's license, says, yes, I'll be an organ donor, know that that's what it's going to look like, that they're going to still have a beating heart, et cetera. And that's just for brain death, but also for cardiac death. In a lot of those cases, what happens is you actually turn off the ventilator because you say, like we were talking about before, an extraordinary measure. At a certain point, you might say, okay, they're not brain dead. So the brain is still functioning to some extent, but the ventilator is now judged to be extraordinary, which can be legitimate, right? You say, okay, we're going to turn off the vent because it's now become extraordinary, burdensome, et cetera. And we expect the patient's going to die in several minutes after turning off the vent. Now, well, how does that look in practice, though? I'm going to be an organ donor. In most cases, that means, well, the family comes and says goodbye to the patient in the patient room. Then they wheel the patient still on the vent to the operating room. And then in the operating room, they turn off the vent. They're going to count the minutes from when the heart stops beating, and then they're going to go in and remove the heart. Now, why do I say that? Not to say that it's necessarily wrong. I'm not trying to go into that discussion right now, though there are serious questions I mentioned before. But just from a human level, the family is not going to be with their loved one when the loved one dies, if we accept this rationale, because the whole idea is you say your goodbyes in most of these cases before we turn the vent off, while everyone agrees the person's still alive. Then they're going to be in the operating room with all of the surgeons ready to go and the transplant team ready to go, to come in next after the doctor declares the person dead, alone, without family, surrounded by clinicians in that dying moment. So it just raises concerns like, okay, do you know that when you sign up to be an organ donor? Maybe it won't change anyone's opinion for some of these people, but the overarching point is that there's not a real informed consent. There's not a real effort on the part of organ donation industry and even many healthcare professionals to say, this is what organ donation actually looks like. If you're comfortable with that, sign up to be an organ donor. If not, don't. It's much more of a marketing effort to say, hey, I just went to renew my driver's license the other day, and literally you're there renewing your driver's license. You go in, every 4 years, and it's just like you go through the steps and click some check boxes, and the person at the desk says, the screen pops up and says, would you like to be an organ donor? Yes or no? And they say, answer yes or no. It's like, okay. what does this mean? Like, what am I agreeing to?
Yeah. So there's consent, but there's no informedness.
Yes, right.
Yes, there's so many things, right? And it is quite striking that in many of these deconstructions of reality, what actually is done effectively is the omitting of knowledge about truth, right?
Yes.
The omitting of information that leads to an informed, as you say, an
Yes.
informed consent. But in order to have an informed consent that is not, tendentious and not going in one, not pressed in one or the other direction, we need that information at our disposal. So for that, I think it's great that you sent that document. Now I think we're coming to an end here, but it's really remarkable how you guys, as the center, but also as Catholics United, which is a different group, have worked out all of these details, and it's great. I think, it would be worthwhile to hear. Did you get any positive feedback after publishing this?
Sure. Yeah.
Feedback?
Well, both.
Okay.
As you might expect. Yeah. I mean, we're trying to build unity in an area where there are some really intense debates, again, particularly in Catholic circles, unfortunately, some intense and longstanding debates. So some people were upset by it. And I would say that's understandable if they're taking the position that there's really no problem with with continuing hypothalamic function, which some Catholics have agreed is not a problem. Again, I don't want to go into that debate, but obviously, if you don't agree on that point, then you don't agree with the document as a whole, because that's the one thing we sort of focus in on. Some of the negative feedback has also been around what I would say are exaggerated concerns that don't reflect the actual reality of what Catholics United says. In other words, concerns around things like, well, this document is actually going to lead people to cling to life at all costs, which is clearly inconsistent with the teachings of the Church. But we actually say in multiple places in the document that it's legitimate, and actually we need more education around the fact that it is legitimate to turn off a ventilator at a certain point, for example. It's not like people are condemned to be forever on ventilators, and to conserve life at all costs. If the ventilator for a given patient becomes extraordinarily burdensome and is no longer sufficiently beneficial, those can be grounds to say, yeah, we're going to turn off the vent. Like, I mentioned earlier in our discussion about that. And so I think that's an exaggerated concern. And it's unfortunate that people point to that as an issue with the document, because we did explicitly address it and called for greater education around that, both for individuals in pastoral settings and in Catholic, parishes and so forth, but also within Catholic healthcare. We talked to, one of our action recommendations was that there be more education for medical staff and healthcare staff around the fact that it can be legitimate to turn off a vent. But the difference or the issue here is that it is around whether we're taking organs from somebody who is declared brain dead while still on the vent. There's no issue with the vent is disproportionate, we're going to turn it off and let them die that way. Okay. But that may or may not be compatible with organ donation. In other words, you might not be able to actually donate your organs if you go that route, or if you do, it's going to be through DCD, circulatory death, once you remove the vent. But anyway, so that's an issue. And then, but I would say positive feedback, we've gotten a lot of positive feedback, much more positive feedback than negative. And lots of people have been sharing the document. They're very grateful for it. They're pleased to see that, there's somebody trying to point to, as you said, this practical issue apart from the principal debate, which, is a real, like, everyone is very concerned with the reality on the ground. And so while we're not trying to resolve the academic discussions at this time, through this document anyway, right? We're trying to give everybody a practical path forward based on overwhelming evidence of the way things are done in reality, as opposed to what the intellectual discussions might be around at the level of principle. I guess I just say I want to make one last clarification, which you made yourself, actually, that being an ethicist at the National Catholic Bioethics Center, we actually also put out a statement on brain death. So I don't want anyone to be confused that the statement we've been talking about this whole time is called Catholics United on Brain Death and Organ Donation, which is by Dr. Ebley, Dr. Colosi, and myself. And the other document is called Integrity in the Determination of Brain Death, and that's by the National Catholic Bioethics Center as an organization, which I also contributed to, but which does not have action recommendations that go into the level of detail that Catholics United does, but it does identify all the same fundamental issues of the need for a restatement and a clarification of the philosophical concept of what death is. It calls for strengthening of ethical standards around determination of death, and it also calls to educate people on this issue as well, particularly clinical and administrative leaders on this issue. And it starts from the same fundamental recognition of the issue of hypothalamic function, and that this is something which, you know, is being pushed forward. These new guidelines from the American Academy of Neurology, the effort to change the Determination of Death Act, which were both not good, you know, so there was a recognition by the NCBC as an organization of those same issues, but not all of the same practical recommendations, like, you know, not being an organ donor or, you know, conscientious objection. Those are all things from Catholics United and not from the NCBC statement, official statement.
Got it. Well, I mean, the last thing that remains to say, anyways, that we'll put some links in the description for the documents in question, so people can read for themselves, which I think is always a good thing.
Yes. Excellent.
That in education, I've seen that actually a good thing when people actually go to the original text and not
primary
just
sources.
Intelligent people news about it, as in your case.
Yes.
So.
Yes.
Well, John, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for explaining all of this. I hope that will bring light to the debate, also light to the individuals that are in these situations that have to make a decision. And the NCBC is putting out podcasts that people can listen to if they want to hear more about this. You, I'm sure, can be reached as well through the center.
Yes.
For questions and answers, and even some bioethical counseling if necessary. And well, we'll keep up with the debate, and I'm sure that we'll be in touch in the future again. But at this point, thank you for your time for the interview, and well, I wish you all the best.
My pleasure, Jan. Thank you so much, and thank you to your listeners.